We're going to cover the Great War, focusing on some strategies, but also on some related issues of the impact of technology, and also in how it affected politics internally, but also the diplomacy among the great powers. Just as a caveat, the AP exam doesn't really cover details of battles, but it does cover warfare and the impact that it has on those areas I just mentioned. So keep that in mind as I go through this. So one of the features that's really noted about the Great War is the introduction of technologies. So those listed on the left-hand side were technologies that had been used prior in warfare, like trenches were used in the Crimean and American Civil War. Machine guns had been used to conquer Africa and Asia for imperialism, and mentioned obviously railroads had been used as well. But these were really used extensively for the first time in warfare and applied, and therefore had important impacts on tactics and strategy. Those listed on the right-hand side were inventions that were developed during the Great War, usually to try to break out of the stalemate. Generally, they didn't have that impact. Mostly what they did is they just increased the death count. So the main takeaway here is that these technologies reveal the discrepancy between traditional tactics, which were usually taught in 19th century military colleges, massed infantry assaults a la Napoleon, and then the gap between that and new technologies. And this inability to sort of square that circle yielded the massive casualties, and also the stalemate, particularly on the Western Front, which is the iconic area that we think of for the First World War. And one thing I'll just add is in warfare we talk about theaters. A theater is a major area of military operations. So for the First World War you would have the Western Front, the Eastern Front, the Balkan Front. You also had a front in the Middle East for the Ottoman Empire, as well as also the what's called Asanzo Front between Italy and Austria-Hungary. And of course there's other fronts as well, but those are the major ones in Europe and the Middle East. So a few terms. Tactics and strategy sometimes are intermingled, but they don't mean exactly the same thing. Tactics is using armies to realize some kind of a battlefield objective, which may be defeating the enemy army and forcing them to retreat. It may be capturing a strategically vital position, like a fortress or a river or a canal or something to that effect. So some military leaders are great tacticians. Obviously, Napoleon would be an example. Strategy is a broader concern. It's using warfare to achieve a political objective. We've talked about this before. So you can be a brilliant tactician, but be a poor strategist. Force to space ratio is basically the volume of firepower in a given geographic area. So World War I is unique in the fact that it has both intensive and extensive firepower compared to previous wars. So intensive is the just like absolute volume of firepower that you're putting in a particular space. In this case, small spaces, the entire northeast of Europe, just basically stretching between Switzerland all the way up to the English Channel. That would include Belgium, France, Luxembourg, and you're just basically pouring in a massive amount of resources. But these battles were also more extensive. So if you might remember at the beginning of the year, I showed you a little clip of Agincourt during the 100 Years' War. Basically, the battlefield of Agincourt would be no bigger than the square footage of the Hinsdale Central's outside buildings, including the building itself. Okay, so to compare that with the Battle of the Somme, which would be massive, that would be almost the comparison between that Hinsdale Central and the entire state of Illinois. So you're really concentrating a massive amount of firepower in a small space. Then we also have no man's land, which is the sort of metaphor for the First World War. It's the space between the enemy lines, and by several months into the war, it was completely denuded of any kind of human habitation, civilization, and also vegetation, which meant that when the rains came, it basically just turned into like muck and mire. And no man's land varied between several hundred yards, or maybe even less, and several miles. And then the usual strategy, which did not work very well, is called over the top. So over the top was basically you would have a massive frontal infantry assault, which is usually preceded by hours, if not days, of artillery bombardment, which had the negative effect of telegraphing to the enemy exactly where your attack was going to happen. It wasn't terribly effective. And then you would just blow a whistle and everybody would run out into the middle of no man's land. And clearly that didn't work generally. So strategists or tacticians tried to adapt things. So they had adapted what's called bite and hold, which was to capture strategic places on the enemy line and then try to hold on to them in the face of counterattacks, which would cause the enemy to lose massive casualties, because usually when you attack, you lose more men than when you're defending. Also, rolling barrages was developed by a British general, which was to have a barrage that preceded just by a couple of hundred yards the advancing troops to give them more cover. And then infiltration units were almost a little bit like stormtroopers, as they would, smaller units, sometimes they would attack at night to try to capture strategic locations, and then try to undermine the communications in the enemy trenches, and also to, cause morale to drop, because of the feeling that you were being overwhelmed in a targeted way, in a way that you couldn't respond very effectively to. There was some limited success with these various tactics. So this is just your sort of standard diagram of no man's land, which usually consisted of 3 trenches. So you have like a front line trench here, where you'd have like basically would be skirmishers and people keeping a lookout into enemy lines. You would also have saps, which would be smaller little trenches dug out into no man's land as observation posts, where you'd have those little sort of telescopes around sandbags and other defensive measures. And then your support trench is here, which would be obviously troops to aid the front trench if there was any overwhelming that position. Then you'd have a reserve trench back here. And obviously in between would be no man's land. And then in the rear, you'd have communications with a new radio and also artillery to add support to any attacks that might be launched. So the war basically kind of unfolded in 3 phases. I'm not going to go into every single little detail here. One way to view the conflict is a series of German gambles, which in general terms did not pay off. So the first phase is called the War of Illusion, because each combatant was trying to implement their very idealistic military plans. So the German plan is the one that really is the focal point here, the Schlieffen plan, because it requires them to attack France even though they've declared war on Russia first. The French are able to stop that advance at the so-called Miracle of the Marne. In actual fact, Germany had much more success in the east against the Russian army, defeating them in 2 major battles in East Prussia, in fact capturing an entire Russian army of 100,000 men. And then on the eastern front, or the western front, you had, by the end of the year, the failure strategically of any side to win its goals. And let's not forget, 1914, just from August until the end of the year, was one of the deadliest years of the war. 1 million troops died just in those several months. And so one of the symbols of the end of this failure to realize their objectives is the Christmas truce, where troops from both sides cavorted in no man's land and actually sometimes sang songs together and exchanged drinks and pictures and played soccer. So to break out of this stalemate, 1915, the war expanded. New countries got involved to achieve their objectives. The Ottoman Empire joined in November of 1914. Bulgaria joined in 1915 to reverse some of the losses it experienced in the Second Balkan War to Serbia. So these 4 countries would be the central powers: Germany, Austria-Hungary, Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. The rest of the countries were called the Allied and Associated Powers. Italy, though it was allied with Austria-Hungary and Germany in the Triple Alliance, was bribed into the war in May of 1915 with the promise of Austrian territory. Romania also joined the Allies. By the way, Romania had the strategic resource of oil. Greece had a major disagreement within the country between the king and the prime minister, but the Allies basically almost coerced Greece to join the conflict so they could rescue the Serbian army that was trying to retreat from the oncoming Central Powers. And then, of course, the United States joined in 1917 due to some German policies. One of the major offensives, mostly because of what it symbolizes, is the Gallipoli offensive, and what Winston Churchill, who was the first Lord of the Admiralty, called the soft underbelly of Europe. It was a really poorly planned attack, mostly spearheaded by New Zealand Australian forces called Anzac forces. By the way, Canada also contributed to the war on the Western Front, as did much of the rest of the empire. So 10% of the troops, for example, on the Western Front were non-Europeans from places like India and Sub-Saharan Africa. And as you probably might guess, they were not given the best assignments. Sometimes they were given suicidal missions, or they were just on labor gangs. But it did have the impact of sort of stitching the world together more globally and giving these colonial areas more of a sense of self-identity, the determination to have self-determination and independence at the end of the war. Also, one of the major effects in 1915 was the Lusitania was sunk. So Germany realized that it was starting to run out of time, and that the United States was supplying many more materials and loans to the Allied powers. And so the only way they felt like they could deal with this is to try to starve Great Britain out in a similar way. So they began sinking ships that were headed towards the British Isles. And the sinking of the Lusitania in May of 1915 almost brought the United States into the war. So by 1916 and 1917, the war has been going on for 2 years. The home front is starting to be severely taxed. And so to break out of this stalemate, massive offensives are launched all over in many theaters. The Germans launched the Verdun offensive to take the pressure off the French lines. The British launched the Somme offensive, which, by the way, July 1st, 1916, when that was launched, is known as the bloodiest day in British history. 30,000 troops died in 3 hours. On the Eastern Front, Russia had one of its most important successful maneuvers, the Brusilov offensive, led by Alexei Brusilov, who pioneered some of those infiltration tactics, forcing the Austro-Hungarian army back 300 kilometers until they were stabilized by their German allies. And then Italy experienced a massive defeat at the Battle of Caporetto as its lines evaporated. Most of this was alpine fighting in high mountains. Imagine carrying guns and artillery up 10,000-foot peaks. By the end of 1916, Germany was basically being run by a military dictatorship of Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, his important quartermaster, and the Kaiser had become pretty much irrelevant. So by 1917 and 18, every country has experienced exhaustion. Some are experiencing revolution. So Germany once again gambles that the United States will take a long time to get mobilized, so better to knock them out of the conflict, or at least their economic contributions to the Allies, and launch one last major offensive. So the German General Staff announces unrestricted submarine warfare around the British Isles. And along with the Zimmermann telegram, this brings the United States into the conflict. Not necessarily a strategically important battle, but the Third Battle of Ypres, also known as Passchendaele, is a symbol of the futility of warfare on the Western Front, as the spring offensive was completely bogged down by massive rains and basically just became a blood and mud bath. So Russia at this time experiences 2 revolutions. The Bolsheviks take over in November of 1917, and they eventually pull Russia out of the conflict with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, where they lost massive territory. So because of this, the Germans think they have one last shot to expel, and that is the German Spring Offensive on the Western Front, which at first is highly successful, but then they basically exhaust themselves. And by this time, U.S. troops begin to make a significant mark on the Western Front. So the entrance of the United States is critical for 3 reasons. It psychologically boosts the Ally morale when Germany is already kind of on the verge of exhaustion. The United States provides huge amounts of material and also economic aid. And then also the manpower itself becomes really important in the summer and fall of 1918. So this is your Schlieffen plan, and obviously it didn't exactly come out this way. This far right maneuver here was exhausting. Troops marching 20-25 miles every day for over a month. So eventually what happened is they had to shorten these lines up like this, and this allowed the French army, which was based here, and also some reserve troops around the capital city, to reorganize and fall upon the Germans here at the Battle of the Marne. And then basically you had each side trying to outrun the other to the sea, and all the way down here to Switzerland, until you have thousands of miles of trenches stretching across the Western Front. So this is the sort of stabilization of the Western Front in 1914. So these lines would move a little bit in one direction or the other. Essentially, though, however, we're not talking about massive war of movement here. This is your sort of typical stalemate on the Western Front. So this is the war in the East, just want to emphasize. So this is where these 2 major battles would occur. By the way, Austria-Hungary did poorly both against Serbia and against Russia. Russia gained significant territory, capturing the city of Lemberg, this whole area of Galicia, which is part of Poland today. By the way, this entire area here, Poland and Ukraine, was fought back and forth over between Germany, Austria-Hungary on one side and Russia on the other. This is where, if you have civilian casualties, a lot of them occurred. Frankly, the Russians were probably the most anti-Semitic army at the time because of the pogroms that had been organized by the government. And so lots of Jews were targeted for poor treatment, if not outright killing. So it's estimated that somewhere between 5 and 10 million civilians were killed in that area. Okay, so the Russians held that city of Lemberg for about 9 months before the counterattack in the spring of 1915, where the Central Powers were able to recapture it. So this is the Battle of Gallipoli. The whole idea here was to capture the Straits and to try to use that as a means to supply Russia, and also to link up with it to cut off and surround the Central Powers. So the first goal was to like send ships in through this way, but they were heavily mined, and so they mostly just sunk. So then the next task was an amphibious invasion to land troops here and up here and up here, and then make their way up to Constantinople. However, it was very poorly planned, and the troops just kind of sat there for a long time instead of marching forward. And they were stopped initially by actually a very important person in Turkish history. His name is Mustafa Kemal, later added the name Ataturk, or the First Turk. So he was a colonel at the time, and he basically forced his men to stand their ground no matter, even if they ran out of ammunition. And then by the time he had succeeded in doing that, reinforcements came up. So basically this entire battle of about 10 months was just these British imperial troops just running across open, barren, rocky plains, getting machine gunned to death until they realized this wasn't going to work. This was the idea of Winston Churchill, by the way. He later resigned his position in the government because this was a little bit of a national scandal. Okay, so this also just shows you the Ottoman Empire here. So one thing that the British wanted to do was to intrude into the Middle East to try to undermine the Ottoman Empire, and also there's oil there. And so the fighting there was significant for the future history of the Middle East. You might be familiar with Lawrence of Arabia. So at first the British did poorly. They had an entire army captured at the Battle of Kut al-Amara. It's known as the worst defeat in British history. They were eventually able to regather their forces and capture important cities like Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, and then also Aqaba down here, which is basically the port city in the Red Sea. So that's made famous in the film Lawrence of Arabia, if you ever want to check that out. So the decisions made between France and Great Britain played a key role later on in the way map of the Middle East unfolded. Okay, so then if we go back to the Western Front in 1916, Verdun became the target of the German Chief of Staff, Erich von Falkenhayn. By the way, Germany's strategic thinking was divided between Westerners and Easterners. So Falkenhayn believed that the war would be won in the West. Hindenburg and Ludendorff wanted to focus on the East. So the Battle of Verdun took the French by surprise, and the Germans captured significant fortresses in the city of Verdun. But the battle took on a life of its own, as battles often do, and led to massive casualties. But actually, the battle that had the highest casualties was the Battle of the Somme. Okay, so it's estimated that about 1 million casualties occur, mostly by death by machine gun. Obviously, the other major killer was artillery shells. So unfortunately, these massive assaults, which were successfully measured, quote unquote, in the capture of a couple of hundred yards, caused millions and millions of casualties, and obviously gave a bad reputation for generals who ordered such things. So on the Western Front, basically after some fighting, the Germans tightened up their lines in what was called the Hindenburg Line, and eliminated some of these little bulges that were taking place and adopted more of a defensive position. However, after they were able to defeat Russia in the east, they turned their attention back to fighting on the Western Front. So they launched a massive spring offensive in March of 1918 and captured all this along this line here. They actually could hear the bells of Paris, the church bells of Paris, from about 30 miles away, and they felt like they were very close at this time. But in actual fact, they had already probably expended most of the energy that they had in fighting. And they were told, the soldiers told, like, this is like, you will achieve victory after this one last, just give us one more push. And then when you don't achieve victory, you're completely crushed. So even though it seemed like they were on the verge of victory, in actual fact, it was setting the stage for their ultimate defeat as American troops finally came in and began launching counterattacks along with the French, the British, and the Belgians, pushing the Germans back to this line here of the Armistice of 1918. Okay. By the way, please notice that there really are no troops on German soil. So this lends itself to this whole idea of the stab in the back legend, that the German army didn't lose the war on the battlefield. It lost it because politicians at home, Jews, Democrats, socialists, communists, wanted to undermine the imperial German government just so it could establish a democratic government. And of course, Hitler exploited that to his advantage to promote his Nazi movement. Okay. So just looking at the armies, and this is where we get a little bit more technical, and this is just based on reading that I've done over the years, which armies of the major powers, and I didn't include the United States here just because it entered so late, and I didn't include some of the associated powers, just the major powers in Europe. So I think you'd have to say that based on just like the specific details of fighting, that Germany's army was probably the best. This is a very unhappy way to look at it, although it was used during the Vietnam War. How much money do you spend to kill enemy soldiers? And by that measure, Germany, or the Central Powers even as a whole, were better than the Allied powers. Okay, but that's not really how wars are won. Germany, despite its reputation as being a kind of militaristic, authoritarian culture, actually had a pretty adaptable command structure, which allowed local commanders to adapt tactics based on the local circumstances. The German army was highly disciplined until the very end, when they started to lose massive numbers of troops who surrendered. But prior to that, not very many. However, that doesn't necessarily mean the German army was successful because of its strategic blunders that I highlighted before. France, I think, is a fairly distant second. The French army was kind of hindered by some poor morale at the beginning because of the Dreyfus affair. Its absolute obsession with going on the offensive and the feeling like digging trenches and being defensively minded was going to sap the morale of the troops. It made a series of tactical and strategic blunders, which even led to mutinies in the army, which they were able to calm down. But the French should get certainly a lot of credit for the perseverance in overcoming a lot of the obstacles against probably was a more powerful enemy, the German army. Britain had a very small army to begin with because it was a naval power. It expanded it quickly, which led obviously to the sort of usual problems of getting troops trained and getting ready for battle. The main quote that people remember about the British army is lions led by donkeys. So the troops themselves were courageous and fought well, but often led by sort of very unimaginative strategists, symbolized by Douglas Haig, who's sort of like your old-fashioned general, white hair with a big brushy mustache, who just kind of like, let's keep doing the same thing over and over again. But it was Britain's naval power which made a huge difference in the ultimate outcome of the fighting. And then Russia had its moments, the Brusilov offensive, but essentially faced massive logistical problems and did a poor job equipping its troops at the front, which eventually led to very poor morale, which probably wasn't that great to begin with, and had weak leadership at the top of the country. Now, the Ottoman Empire, you would expect, given its technological deficits, would have been pretty down near the bottom. Actually, they did probably better than you might expect. They had a German general named Lehmann von Sanders who did a pretty good job of helping to modernize and train the army. They did face internal revolts at the end of the war, which was basically their undoing. But they were able to kind of hold their own for a while, and even after the war was over, establish an independent Turkey in the face of some continued Greek and with Allied support assaults. So their big moment was Gallipoli, holding off the British or the imperial invasion. Austria-Hungary and Italy were far down at the bottom. Austria-Hungary's army was just beset by sloppy planning and leadership, all the ethnic issues and the difficulties of communicating among the different groups, and its constant reliance on Germany. Austria-Hungary won almost no battles by itself. It always had to rely on Germany. In Italy, couldn't defeat Austria-Hungary itself and just suffered from a lot of issues, poor planning, poor equipment, and poor leadership throughout the conflict. So these are your casualties. You can just look at this chart, and just the casualty rate is just massive, even more than World War II. Not in terms of absolute numbers killed, but the number of people who entered into the conflict and how many of them were casualties. Actually, Serbia lost the highest percentage of its population overall. About 20% of its population was killed during the war. Germany, in terms of soldiers, had the most killed. Russia easily had the most soldiers captured. And I would just like to add that many other countries joined this conflict. Latin American countries joined, which helped cement and identify them as not just independent countries, which they had been for 80 or 90 years, but also as being more aware of themselves as their place in the world. Japan and China both joined the Allied powers. Japan actually tried to take advantage of China during this time and expand its influence. And this is actually pretty important because it lays the foundations for Japan and the United States being Pacific powers and sets up the stage for their growing conflict, which would lead to the Second World War. So one last thing I want to add is that just because the armistice occurred in November of 1918, there was not a soft landing. There were continued revolutions, revolts, communist takeovers, internal violence, civil wars, small regional conflicts like between Poland and Russia, Greece and Turkey, all kinds of ethnic cleansing campaigns. So it just goes to show the First World War did not just kill the people on the battlefield. It destroyed the balance of power. It destroyed this normal activities of trade and commerce and banking, and just liberated all kinds of ethnic tensions and violence. and would lay the foundations for a lot of the death and destruction of the 20th century.